Is this some kind of joke? The young voice sliced through the air, full of arrogant confidence. Private David's gaze was sharp as he looked at the old man, standing silent, unmoving, in the middle of the firing range. He had to be at least 70, wrinkled, gray-haired, and wearing a faded military jacket that seemed out of place in this modern military facility. The recruits behind him snickered, nudging each other as the old man slowly adjusted his grip on the rifle they handed him. "Hey, Pops," David continued, stepping closer. "You even know how to hold that thing? But you've never fired anything like this before." The air was thick with mockery. The other recruits laughed, nudging each other, their smirks wide, their youth and inexperience blinding them to the truth standing in front of them. The man before them, Mike Harrison, remained calm, his hands steady on the rifle. His eyes, pale blue and piercing, seemed to look beyond them, as though he were reliving something far more dangerous than these young men could ever imagine. For a brief moment, the recruits hesitated, sensing something in the air. But it passed, and the teasing resumed. "You think you can hit that target, Grandpa?" Alex, another recruit, jeered. "We've got all this new gear, and you're still stuck in the past." Mike didn't respond. He just brought the rifle up to his shoulder, his old bones creaking with the effort, but his hands as steady as they'd been in his prime. The target, set at a distance of 300 yards, seemed small and insignificant compared to the battles Mike had fought in. He exhaled slowly, adjusted his aim, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and precise, echoing across the range. A hush fell over the recruits. The target, once firmly in place, now lay crumpled on the ground, completely knocked off its stand. The sound of laughter faded into stunned silence. Private David blinked, his mouth agape, the smirk frozen on his face. His eyes darted to the others, but none of them could say a word. Mike slowly lowered the rifle, his expression unchanged. He glanced at them for the first time, his voice low but clear. "I didn't come here to impress you, son." David's heart raced. He wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or impressed. "Who the hell are you?" Alex blurted out, still unable to process what had just happened. Mike's lips curled into a brief smile. "Mike Harrison. I was part of the original SEAL team, long before most of you were born." The recruits stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. They were dealing with someone they couldn't even begin to comprehend. But it wasn't just his words that hit them. It was the skill, the effortless precision that left them speechless. No more smirks. No more mockery. Just silence. A general, watching from the distance, stepped forward. He recognized the veteran's face immediately, his gaze softening in respect. "Mike Harrison, it's an honor, sir." The recruits, still unable to speak, exchanged glances. They had witnessed something rare, a moment that would redefine what they thought they knew about veterans, about respect, and about true skill. The recruits stood in stunned silence, their eyes locked on Mike Harrison, who hadn't moved an inch since his shot. The wind seemed to still, as though the air itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just that he had knocked the target off. It was the ease with which he had done it. The rifle, an old military model, was nothing like the precision-engineered weapons the recruits used. Yet, in Mike's hands, it seemed to have a life of its own. David was the first to break the silence. He took a step forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Mike turned slightly, his pale blue eyes meeting David's. "It's not about the gun. It's about knowing what you're doing," Mike replied, his voice steady and calm. He didn't look like a man who had just humiliated a group of recruits. Instead, he looked like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The recruits exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to respond. Alex finally spoke up, his tone more respectful now. "We thought you were just some old guy. But you're different." Mike smiled, but there was no pride in it, just quiet acknowledgement. "I've been around a long time, son. I've seen things you can't even begin to imagine." The recruits stood frozen, their youthful bravado completely stripped away. They had just witnessed something they hadn't expected. "So, David started, trying to regain some control over the situation. "What's your secret? Is it just experience?" Mike chuckled softly, but there was no amusement in it. "Experience helps, but it's more about patience. And knowing when to wait. When to listen." The recruits were silent again, each of them considering the gravity of his words. Mike's gaze shifted, looking out over the range as if lost in a memory. For a moment, he wasn't the old man standing before them, but the young soldier in the thick of combat, the sound of gunfire echoing in his ears, the weight of life and death decisions pressing on him. I wasn't always this calm, Mike continued, his voice quieter now. When I was your age, I was hot-headed, eager to prove myself. I learned the hard way that rushing doesn't help. It only gets people killed. The recruits listened, hanging on every word. Mike's voice, though soft, carried the weight of a lifetime of battles fought. I wasn't always a sniper. I started out just like you, training, learning, failing. But the difference is, I learned from my failures. I didn't let them break me. David nodded, finally understanding. He had been so quick to judge, so sure that the old man was just another relic of a bygone era. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. Mike looked back at the recruits, his expression hardening, the moment of vulnerability slipping away. I don't need your respect, he said, his voice firm once again. But you'll find that when you stop thinking you know everything, that's when you start learning. The recruits stood there for a long moment, absorbing the lesson in silence. The air had shifted. They weren't just standing on a firing range anymore. They were standing in the presence of someone who had lived, who had earned his place through blood, sweat, and time. They weren't just looking at an old man. They were looking at a legend, someone who had seen the worst of the world and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but wiser. The moment passed, and the recruits began to slowly disperse, each one lost in their thoughts. David lingered for a moment, then turned to Mike. Thank you for the lesson. Mike gave a small nod. You'll learn a lot more if you keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. The words lingered in the air long after the recruits had left. Mike didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already done what he came to do. The next morning, the recruits gathered again, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no laughter, no jeering, no overconfidence. The air was thick with something unspoken, a tension born from yesterday's events. David stood at the front of the group, his hands clasped behind his back as he glanced over the range. His mind was still reeling from the encounter with Mike Harrison. He had never expected that a simple, old veteran could show him and his team up so easily. And yet, here they were, each of them humbled. All right, men, David called out, his voice more measured than before. We've got a new training exercise today. You'll be working in pairs. One will shoot, the other will spot. He paused, noticing the quiet murmurs from the group. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something had. It wasn't just respect, it was something deeper. He could feel it in the way they stood a little straighter, the way their eyes stayed fixed on the target, not distracted by the usual banter. He cleared his throat. Pair up, and let's get to work. Mike, who had been standing off to the side, watching them quietly, didn't move. His presence seemed to fill the space, even though he didn't say a word. He wasn't part of the exercise, yet somehow, his influence was impossible to ignore. David moved toward the rifle range and set up the first target. The recruits worked in silence, but the quiet was different now. It was a silent agreement to focus, to learn. Alex, one of the more outspoken recruits, had been paired with Private Ryan for the exercise. They set up the spotting scope and took turns, trying to hit the target. But as the session wore on, it became clear that they weren't hitting their marks. Their shots were close, but not quite there. Alex frowned, frustrated, his confidence shaken. He looked at Ryan, who shrugged. Maybe we should ask Mike for some advice, Alex muttered under his breath. Ryan raised an eyebrow. You think he'll help us? Alex looked over at Mike, still standing in the same spot, watching them silently. He didn't think Mike would help. He didn't expect anything from the man. But there was something about the way Mike had looked at them, not with disdain but with an understanding that they hadn't earned his respect yet. Alex sighed and waved Ryan over. Let's ask him. They approached Mike, their footsteps hesitant. Mike didn't look up, but they could feel his attention shift toward them as they stood in front of him. What's the matter, boys? Mike asked, his voice calm and steady. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. He hadn't expected to feel this nervous asking for help. He wasn't used to being the one asking questions. We can't seem to hit the target, Alex admitted, his voice quieter now. We've tried everything, but something's off. Mike nodded, looking over at the range. Let me see your rifle. Alex hesitated for a moment, but handed it over. Mike took the rifle, his hands steady and sure. He checked the scope, adjusted the settings, and handed it back. Try again, he said simply. Alex and Ryan exchanged a glance, but did as they were told. This time, when Alex took aim, something clicked. The shot was perfect, dead center. He looked back at Mike, who gave him a small nod. It's not about the gear, Mike said. It's about understanding the fundamentals and trusting yourself. Don't let the noise get to you. Alex was speechless. The solution had been so simple. Mike hadn't lectured them. He hadn't made a big show of his expertise. He had just given them a nudge in the right direction. The rest of the session passed in a quiet, focused rhythm. The recruits hit their marks more consistently, each shot ringing out with a sense of accomplishment they hadn't felt before. Mike remained a silent observer, but his presence was like a guiding hand. By the end of the day, David stood at the front of the group again, but this time, there was something different in the air. You did well today, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a new understanding. But remember, it's not just about shooting straight. It's about knowing when to listen, when to learn, and when to be quiet long enough to hear the lesson. The recruits nodded, their expressions more thoughtful than they had been just a day before. They knew they had learned something far more important than how to fire a rifle. They had learned the value of humility, of experience, and of listening to those who had walked the path before them. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, the recruits now moving with a newfound respect for their training and their instructors. The change in the air wasn't something that could be put into words, but it was there, lingering in the space between them, like an unspoken agreement. David walked across the grounds, his hands in his pockets, his thoughts a little heavier than they had been before. He glanced over at the shooting range where Mike had been observing them silently for days now. Mike hadn't said much, but his presence had done more to shape the recruits than any of the drills they had been put through. He had given them a lesson, not in shooting, but in what it meant to be a soldier. As David walked, he heard a voice behind him. "Private David, got a minute?" He turned to see Lieutenant Anderson, a man known for his sharp, no-nonsense attitude. "Yes, sir," David replied, coming to a stop. "Good work out there," Anderson said, his expression neutral. "I've seen a change in the team, and it's because of you." David blinked, surprised. "Me, sir?" "You've done something the others haven't," Anderson continued. "You've started leading by example. The others are following your lead now." David felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of his responsibilities settling on him. He had never seen himself as a leader before, not like the officers he had grown up admiring. But now he could feel it. The shift in the way the others looked at him. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was trust. I didn't do anything special, sir. We just trained. That's all." "No, it's more than that," Anderson said, stepping closer. "You've started to understand what it really means to lead. And that's what we need around here." David nodded, taking in the words, but feeling the pressure of them, like a weight he hadn't been prepared for. He had always been good at following orders, but now, it seemed, he was being asked to give them. "We've got a special exercise tomorrow," Anderson said, breaking the silence. "It'll be a test of everything you've learned so far. But this time, you'll be in charge of your team. You'll have to make the decisions." David's heart began to race. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. "I'll do my best, sir," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "That's all I ask," Anderson replied. "Good luck." As the lieutenant walked away, David turned back toward the range, where Mike stood watching the recruits. Mike's eyes met his for a brief moment, and in that instant, David felt something pass between them. It wasn't a look of approval or acknowledgement, it was something deeper. Mike had seen the shift in him, the same way he had seen the shift in the others. And though Mike didn't need to say anything, David knew that the lesson he had given them wasn't over. It had just begun. The next day, the exercise began. David stood at the front of his team, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. They were waiting for his orders. He looked over the range, his mind running through everything they had learned, everything he had been taught by Mike and the others. The wind, the angles, the distance. He could see it all clearly now, just like Mike had taught him. "All right, team," David said, his voice steady. "Let's make this count. Follow my lead." They moved into position, and David felt something inside him click. He was no longer just a recruit. He was a part of something bigger, something more important. And he was ready to lead. The exercise went smoothly, the recruits working together as they had been taught. David didn't need to give many orders. His team followed his lead without hesitation, trusting him just as he had learned to trust them. By the end of the day, They had completed the task ahead of schedule, each of them moving with a purpose they hadn't had before. As they gathered at the end of the range, Mike approached them, his eyes scanning the group. "Good work, boys," he said, his voice low but filled with approval. David felt a surge of pride. He had done it. He had led them. And he had done it well. Mike gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had all been on. David didn't need words. He had earned his place among them. He had earned their respect, not because of a title, but because of his actions. And in that moment, he knew that he had finally understood what it meant to be a soldier, not just in the field, but in life. The morning of the next exercise arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. The recruits had come a long way since their first encounter with Mike Harrison, and they now carried themselves differently. They moved with purpose, their steps more measured, their eyes sharper. David, leading the group, could feel the weight of their expectations on his shoulders. He had proved himself in the last exercise, but today would be different. Today, it wasn't just about hitting targets. Today, they would face a challenge that would test everything they had learned. As they assembled near the starting point, Lieutenant Anderson appeared, his expression unreadable. "You've all come a long way," he said, addressing the group. "But today, we push you harder. This is not just about accuracy. It's about teamwork, leadership, and adaptability. You'll be working together, but each of you will have to make decisions on the fly. This is a test of your skills, your instincts, and your ability to lead when it matters most." David took a deep breath, steadying himself. He glanced at his team, seeing the same resolve in their eyes that he felt in his chest. The challenge ahead would push them all, but they were ready. They had Mike's lessons in their minds, the quiet strength he had shown them, and they had learned what it meant to lead by example. "All right, team," David said, his voice steady. "Let's get to work." They moved into position, each member taking up their role. David stood at the front, scanning the area with the same focus he had developed over the past few days. The exercise was set up like a mock mission, with multiple objectives scattered across the terrain. Some targets were static, while others would appear unexpectedly, forcing them to adapt quickly. David's heart rate picked up as he took his first step forward. He felt the same rush of adrenaline he had felt on the firing range, but this time, there was more at stake. His team was relying on him. He could hear the rustling of his teammates moving behind him, their footsteps in sync, their breathing steady. They had learned to trust each other, to work as one. As they approached the first objective, a target appeared in the distance. Without hesitation, David raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "Covering fire," he called, his voice calm, but firm. Private Ryan took his position, raising his rifle to provide cover while the others moved forward. David motioned for Alex and the others to follow him, and they quickly took up their positions around the target. They were a well-oiled machine now, each movement calculated, each decision made with confidence. They hit the target flawlessly, just as they had trained. But there was no time to celebrate. The next challenge appeared immediately, a moving target in the distance. The team moved swiftly, adjusting their positions and communicating silently, their eyes locked on the target. David knew this was a critical moment. They had been trained to be quick and precise, but now, they would have to be adaptable. As the target moved, so did his team, following his lead without question. They fired in unison, and once again, they succeeded. David felt a sense of pride, but it was fleeting. There was no room for complacency. They pressed on, completing the next objectives with ease, their teamwork flawless. The final objective was ahead, the hardest challenge yet. It was a timed race to the finish, with obstacles and moving targets scattered across the course. They had to move fast, think fast, and work together like never before. David's mind raced as he surveyed the course. This was the moment that would define them. He looked back at his team. They were ready. "On my mark," he said, his voice calm and steady. 3, 2, 1, go. They sprinted forward, their movements fluid and precise. Each obstacle they encountered was met with quick thinking and teamwork. The final stretch was ahead, and David pushed himself harder, urging his team on. They crossed the finish line together, just as the clock ran out. They had done it. The sound of the timer beeping echoed in their ears, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the team let out a collective breath, their faces flushed with exertion. They had pushed themselves to their limits, and they had succeeded. David turned to his team, his chest swelling with pride. "We did it," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. "We did it together." The recruits stood around him, breathing heavily, their faces showing the same sense of accomplishment. They knew they had earned something today, not just the success of the exercise, but the trust they had built with each other. They had proven to themselves that they were a team. And for the first time, David truly felt like a leader. Lieutenant Anderson approached them, his face unreadable as always, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good work, team," he said. "You've earned this. But remember, the real test is what comes next. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep leading." David nodded, his heart still racing from the rush of the exercise. But deep down, he knew Anderson was right. This was just the beginning. They had learned what it meant to be a team, to trust each other, and to lead with confidence. And as they walked off the field, David knew that this experience would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The days following the exercise had a strange stillness to them, like the calm before a storm. The recruits, still riding the high of their success, moved with a sense of purpose they hadn't had before. David could feel the change in them. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were living each moment with intention, aware of the responsibility that came with their training. Mike Harrison had vanished after the last exercise, slipping quietly away as he always did. But his lessons had stayed with them, ingrained in their minds like a constant whisper. David stood in the barracks that evening, looking out over the horizon. The setting sun cast long shadows across the field, the same field where just days ago, they had pushed themselves to their limits. It felt like a lifetime had passed. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. He turned to see Lieutenant Anderson standing in the doorway. "Private David," Anderson said, his voice steady. "I need to speak with you." David stood up, his heart racing a little. He had no idea what this was about. "Yes, sir," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've been doing good work, leading your team," Anderson began, his eyes meeting David's. "But now, we're going to push you further. There's an advanced training exercise tomorrow. It's not going to be easy. And this time, you won't be the one leading." David raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Sir," Anderson's eyes darkened slightly. "You're going to be tested in a different way. Tomorrow, you're going to be part of a new team. One you won't have control over. You'll have to follow someone else's lead." David's heart sank slightly. He had never been in a position like that before. He was used to being in charge, making the decisions. But now, he would have to let someone else take the reins. "Understood, sir," David said, his voice steady despite the unease settling in his stomach. "Good," Anderson said, his tone more approving now. "I want to see how you adapt when you're not the one calling the shots." David nodded, though his mind was already racing with the implications of the task ahead. The next day, the team assembled early, as usual. But this time, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The recruits were nervous, their faces a little more serious than usual. David could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure what to expect, but they knew it was going to be something different. The instructor for the new exercise was a seasoned officer, someone none of them had worked with before. As he briefed the group on the task ahead, David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The exercise would take them into the wilderness, testing their navigation and survival skills. But the catch was that they had to rely on each other. They would have to trust their team leader to guide them through the challenges ahead. David swallowed hard. He wasn't used to being in the position of following someone else's orders. He had learned to lead, to make the hard decisions, but now he had to let go of that control and trust in someone else's judgment. The day went on, the tension building as they made their way through the terrain. The team leader, Sergeant Harris, was a quiet, no-nonsense kind of person. David had never worked with her before, but it was clear from the start that she was competent. She gave clear, concise orders, and the team moved without hesitation, executing each task with precision. David followed her lead, doing his best to stay in line, but inside, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had always been the one in charge, the one calling the shots. But now, he had to suppress that instinct and listen. He had to trust Harris. As the day wore on, the challenges became more difficult. They had to navigate through dense woods, cross rivers, and set up camp in the wilderness. Each task tested their patience and teamwork. David noticed something he hadn't expected. Despite his initial discomfort, he was learning from Harris. Her calmness under pressure, her ability to make quick decisions, was something he had been too focused on perfecting in himself to notice before. He began to see the value in following, in being part of a team without needing to lead. When the night came, and they settled around the campfire, David sat in silence, reflecting on the day. Harris had been the leader, but he had learned just as much from being a part of the team as he had from being in charge. It was a humbling experience, and for the first time in a long time, David felt the weight of the lesson Mike had taught him. True leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about understanding when to step back and let others lead. As the fire crackled, David felt a quiet sense of peace. He knew he wasn't done learning, but he also knew he was ready for whatever came next. The following weeks passed with a quiet intensity. The recruits had settled into a rhythm, each day a little more refined than the last. The lessons from Mike Harrison and the exercises with Sergeant Harris had changed something in them. David could feel it in the way they moved, in the way they communicated without words, in the way they trusted each other. But even as the team grew stronger, David knew they still had much to learn. The next challenge came sooner than expected. It was another field exercise, but this time, it wasn't just about shooting or navigating. This time, they would be tested on something even more important: their ability to think on their feet, to adapt to unforeseen situations, and to lead under pressure. Lieutenant Anderson gathered them early in the morning, his face serious. "Today, you'll be facing a scenario that will test every skill you've learned," he said, his voice carrying a weight that immediately silenced the group. "There will be no set objectives, no clear path. You will have to think quickly, adapt, and work together. Some of you will be in charge, others will follow. But everyone will have a part to play." David stood at the back of the group, listening closely. He could feel the tension rise in the air. The last few exercises had been challenging, but this one felt different. He knew this would push them further than ever before. As the group moved out, they were given a set of vague instructions: navigate through a dense forest, find a series of hidden markers, and then report back. But there was a catch. The scenario was designed to force them into difficult decisions that could change the outcome of the exercise. It wasn't just about finding the markers. It was about how they worked together when things didn't go as planned. As they made their way into the forest, the recruits moved with quiet efficiency, their training taking over. David could feel the familiar sense of control return as he led the group. But soon, the first challenge appeared. A sudden downpour began to fall, soaking them within moments. The trail they had been following became slippery and difficult to navigate. David looked at his team, his mind racing. This was the first test. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice calm. "Private Ryan, take the lead and find us cover." The team moved quickly, but as they pushed through the dense underbrush, the obstacles began to multiply. The trail was harder to follow, and the markers they had been looking for were nowhere to be found. It was clear that the situation was not going as planned. David could feel the frustration rising in the group, but he also felt something else. A quiet understanding that they had to keep moving forward, even if they didn't have all the answers. "We need to adapt," David said, his voice steady. "We're going off course. Trust each other, and we'll figure this out." They pressed on, using the skills they had learned, working together, communicating in silence, and relying on each other to stay on track. It wasn't easy, but slowly, they began to make progress. As the day wore on, the storm subsided, and the team found themselves at the edge of a small clearing. There, they spotted the next marker. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. They had overcome the first obstacle, and they had done it together. The next challenge came soon after, a difficult decision that would require them to split into smaller groups. David had to decide who would stay behind, to guard the equipment, and who would continue on to find the final marker. It was a tough choice, but he made it quickly, trusting his team's ability to handle the situation. As the group pressed on, they faced more unexpected obstacles: a river they had to cross, a thick patch of thorny bushes, and a miscommunication that nearly sent them off course again. But each time, David relied on the lessons he had learned. He stayed calm, trusted his instincts, and listened to his team. When they finally reached the final marker, they were exhausted but elated. They had made it, and they had made it together. As they gathered back at the starting point, Lieutenant Anderson approached them, his face unreadable. He didn't speak at first, just watched them closely. Finally, he nodded. "Well done," he said, his voice low. "You've all proven something today. You didn't just follow orders. You worked together, you adapted, and you led when it mattered. David stood tall, feeling the weight of Anderson's words. They had done more than just complete an exercise. They had learned what it meant to lead without control, to follow without hesitation, and to trust each other in the face of uncertainty. As the team walked back to camp, David couldn't help but smile. They had come so far since that first day, and he knew they were ready for whatever came next. The road ahead would be challenging, but he had no doubt they would face it as a team. The weeks that followed were filled with a constant push for improvement. The team was tested again and again, each new exercise more challenging than the last. The recruits had grown accustomed to adversity, and David had learned to trust them as much as they had learned to trust him. But there was a new sense of urgency in the air now. They were preparing for something bigger. The words from Lieutenant Anderson echoed in David's mind. This is just the beginning. They had completed multiple exercises, each with a new twist designed to test their limits. Now, they were gearing up for something that would push them further than they had ever been pushed before. The morning of the next exercise arrived, and the recruits gathered as usual. There was no banter, no casual chatter. They were all focused, their faces serious. Even David could feel the tension, his body already anticipating what was to come. Today is different, Lieutenant Anderson said, walking toward them with a sense of purpose. This isn't just another training exercise. This is a real-world simulation. You'll be put in situations where you have to make critical decisions, and your actions will have real consequences. The recruits exchanged looks, the weight of Anderson's words sinking in. They had faced tough challenges before, but this felt different. You'll be split into teams, Anderson continued. And you'll face a series of challenges that will test your decision-making skills, your ability to think under pressure, and your leadership abilities. There will be no second chances. You either succeed or fail. David felt a lump form in his throat. He had led his team before, but this felt like something much more serious. The stakes were higher, the pressure greater. He glanced at his team. They were all looking at him with a mix of determination and uncertainty. He knew they were all feeling the same weight. The scenario will unfold as you progress, Anderson said. You won't know what to expect. Just remember, adapt, trust your team, and lead when the moment calls for it. As the exercise began, the recruits were thrust into a chaotic simulation. They had to navigate through a series of obstacles, some physical, some mental. They encountered unexpected challenges at every turn, a communications failure, a sudden change in terrain, and the constant pressure of making decisions with limited time. David found himself leading once again, but this time, the choices he made felt heavier. Every decision carried more weight, more potential consequences. He could feel the eyes of his team on him, waiting for him to make the right call. But the uncertainty was palpable. At one point, the team was faced with a critical decision. Take a safer, longer route, or attempt a riskier shortcut. David paused, thinking through the possibilities. The safer route would take more time, and they risked falling behind schedule. The shortcut, however, was dangerous. It was a gamble, one that could either pay off or backfire. He looked at his team, seeing the trust in their eyes. They were waiting for him to lead, to make the tough decision. We take the shortcut, David said, his voice steady. But we move fast, and we move carefully. No hesitation. The team nodded, and they moved quickly, navigating the difficult terrain with determination. The shortcut proved to be more challenging than they had expected, but they made it through. When they reached the next checkpoint, David could see the relief in their faces. They had made it. But the exercise was far from over. As they moved forward, the challenges kept coming, each one more difficult than the last. They had to work together to solve problems, support each other, and keep moving despite the exhaustion that was setting in. David led them through it all, trusting his instincts and the lessons he had learned from his team. By the end of the day, they were exhausted, but they had succeeded. They had faced every obstacle head-on and come out stronger on the other side. As they stood in front of Lieutenant Anderson, waiting for feedback, David felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt before. Anderson looked at each of them, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. You've all done well, he said. This wasn't easy, and you've proven that you can handle the pressure. But this is just the beginning. The real test comes when you're out there, in the field, and the stakes are even higher. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep leading. As they walked back to the barracks, David felt a quiet satisfaction. They had completed the toughest challenge yet, and he had led them through it. But he also knew that this was just one step on a long journey. There was still so much to learn, so much to do. But for the first time, David was certain of one thing. They were ready for whatever came next. The days after the grueling exercise passed quickly, the recruits continuing their training with a newfound determination. But even as they moved forward, the weight of what they had learned settled heavily on David's shoulders. He had led his team through every challenge, adapting, trusting his instincts, and learning what it truly meant to be a leader. Yet, he knew that their journey was far from over. The final phase of training was approaching, and with it, the most difficult test they would face. The night before the final exercise, David sat alone in his bunk, staring out the small window at the dark sky. The stars were scattered across the expanse above, distant and cold, reminding him of the long road ahead. He had come so far, but there was still so much to prove. The pressure of leading his team weighed heavily on him, and though he had gained their respect, he felt the burden of responsibility. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see Lieutenant Anderson standing in the doorway. "Private David," Anderson said, his tone steady. "Got a minute?" "Yes, sir," David replied, sitting up straight. Anderson stepped inside, his gaze serious. "You've done well so far," he said, his voice low but carrying an unspoken approval. "But the real test is tomorrow. It's not just about the drills or the exercises. Tomorrow, you'll be tested on who you are as a leader. And I want you to know, this is as much about your team as it is about you." David swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Sir, what do you mean?" Anderson gave him a small, knowing smile. "Tomorrow, your team will be placed in situations where you won't have all the answers. You'll be forced to make decisions without knowing the outcome. It's going to be messy, and it's going to be tough. But that's when true leadership shows. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. The recruits are looking to you, and you need to trust them as much as they trust you." David nodded slowly, taking in Anderson's words. It wasn't about perfection. It was about adaptation, about learning to lead in the face of uncertainty. "Understood, sir," he said, his voice steady. Anderson gave him a final look, a silent approval. "Get some rest, David. Tomorrow's a new day." The next morning, the team gathered once again, their faces reflecting the same nervous energy that had filled the air on their first day. This time, however, there was something different about them. They were no longer just recruits. They were a team, and each of them had grown in ways they hadn't imagined. As they moved to the starting point of the final exercise, David's heart pounded in his chest. The terrain was unfamiliar, the objectives unclear. There were no clear paths, no easy answers. Only decisions to be made, and consequences to face. The exercise was designed to push them to their limits, to challenge everything they had learned. David looked over at his team, their eyes meeting his with silent trust. He knew they were ready. "All right, team," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We stick together. We adapt. We lead, no matter what happens." The exercise began, and David felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but this time, it was different. There was no time to second-guess, no time to dwell on mistakes. Every choice had to be made in the moment, and each step forward was uncertain. As they navigated the obstacles and challenges, David saw his team in a new light. They weren't just following orders. They were thinking, adapting, and working together in ways they hadn't before. When the final challenge arrived, David felt a sense of clarity. They were ready, not because they had all the answers, but because they had learned to trust each other, to rely on each other's strengths, and to lead as a united front. They completed the exercise with precision, their teamwork flawless. And when they gathered at the end, waiting for Lieutenant Anderson's evaluation, David felt a deep sense of pride. Anderson walked up to them, his face unreadable as always. For a moment, he said nothing, just looking at each of them, his eyes scanning their faces. Then he spoke. "You did it. You passed. But more importantly, you proved something. You proved that you're ready. Not just for this training, but for what comes next." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had made it. They had come through the toughest test yet, not as individuals, but as a team. And as they stood there, facing Anderson, David knew that they had earned more than just their success. They had earned each other's trust. They had earned their place as soldiers, and the journey that had begun with uncertainty was now one of unshakable confidence. They were ready for whatever the future held.